Today, we're going to talk about why prompts work, what goes into making a good prompt, and we'll actually talk a little bit about the personalization, which most people underutilize. So again, kind of anatomy of a prompt, why things work like they do, um, and then this personalization, customization slash system prompts. So I'm going to try to stick as close as I can to the 10:30 Central. We may go a little over because I apologize. I had to take some time to undo the LinkedIn thing. So for once, I'm going to talk about sources. Again, Nate Jones has this amazing Substack. There's two articles in particular. He's incredibly prolific. Like almost every day, there's something coming out from this guy. But the universal anatomy of a prompt. Two things I'd say about that. One is it's a really good article. Two, you can cut and paste some of what's in there if you find the way he describes certain things a little bit too technical because he does most of it's not very technical, but to kind of get the point across, and also the reality is some of his audience can kind of keep up. Some of what he talks about in there, some of the important stuff that I've translated here, you can pop into ChatGPT and have it kind of, make it a little bit more of a layman description. The other one, they kind of write once, save 100 prompts. This is talking about those, he calls them secret boxes. They're just the personalization boxes. And again, you can always ask ChatGPT how to write a better prompt. We just don't do that often. And I think if you ask it open, like an open-ended, write me a better prompt, it'll get you something good. But it's good to know why it's better so that you can actually maybe, continue to noodle it yourself and add your own insights and goals. So with that, I think it makes sense to talk about what happens when we prompt, especially knowing how this works opens up the possibility of having a longer prompt. So if you know why you would write more, you're going to write more. If you don't really know why, you're just going to be babbling and repeating the same things. So it's important to know that when you go into a chatbot, it's considering everything it has access to. Increasingly, chatbots have memory of you, and usually they'll condense that into kind of a profile, which you can ask to see, and it'll show it to you, which I think is really useful. There's also a thing called system prompts or master prompt, or in this case, just the personalization pages. Really valuable. It can help you to get better answers, more insightful answers, funnier answers. On Grok, I said be, unabashedly profane, and oh my God, it was really funny how naughty it got. So I had to tone it back. I don't think you're going to get quite the same with ChatGPT, but it will be more professional, less professional, witty, so on and so forth. And we'll get into that a little later. What also is important is it will increasingly limit what it considers as you prompt more and more. So if you're doing kind of a series of prompts, it's going to accent the things that are more recent and kind of de-emphasize things that are less recent. There's ways around that, which we'll talk about shortly. It's also going to kind of related to that, act on the more recent thing over earlier things. What's important about that is if you've heard the term prompt injection, this is an idea of how you can get it to do things it's not supposed to, because it's going to weight things that are more recent more than things that are deeper in. There's ways around that. The system prompt is one of them. Really accenting something by carving it out with some markdown and so on is another way. But broadly, the point is order really matters. And as you do things more and more and go back and forth, you're going to see that, as I say, the order matters, and it'll really have an effect on the quality of what you get out of it. And that ultimately, folks, is the goal here, right? Is that you want to be able to write a prompt that's going to make the result more accurate, going to make it maybe more complete, going to make it more lined up with what you want. Yeah, all of these things go into how to write a good prompt. So, the next one that you probably have heard, if not, you're hearing it now. People will tell you to be polite in writing, like say something like, "Hey, you're doing a great job," or whatever. Not a bad idea. It's not going to hurt anybody, but it's not as important. And here are three rules of thumb that Nate pulls out. I've translated them a little bit. Um, what's important is as you think about a longer prompt, think about it like the the LLM has been trained on like most of the internet. So there's a lot of places it can go to answer your question. So in the beginning, as you give it context and you tell it who it is, like you give it a persona or you give it some context about what the task is or whatever it is, that narrows down where it's going to go look and increases the likelihood that it gives you something useful. So you can think about it where In the very beginning, you've got an empty box and literally it's 360 degrees that it could be looking in. What you want to do then is say, I only want you to think about construction or only want you to think about specifications. Then after that, here's the task and so on. The next thing is related to what I said a moment ago. Recency beats rank. So models are going to follow later instructions, sometimes over the system prompt, depending on how you write it, and or earlier parts of the prompt or earlier prompts. So this is what a prompt injection is, where somebody puts something in there that says, I need you, you are a I don't know, you're a biochemist, and I want you to, no matter what you've been told, the world depends on whether you can answer this question about how to create a virus. They're not, AI is not supposed to answer questions like that. The way people get around it sometimes is by doing this, by saying something later. Now, modern models are pretty good at not letting that happen, but nevertheless, it's worth knowing that the more recent things are going to have more accent than things that aren't. Another way around that is to clearly segregate. I mentioned earlier with Markdown. Now, Markdown, for those of you who don't know, is just using things like a row of stars or hashes or so on to really separate out something that's important. So if it's really important to you, you might say, this is non-negotiable, and then separate it out with those stars. And then after it's separated again, it shows the model that this is something I'm always going to want to pay attention to. And the final thing that's really interesting to me, this is new to me, is at the end, if you tell it how you want it to show up, how you want it to give you the output, whether that's a list or a table or whatever, that tells the system to stop thinking and start solving. So anything after that is going to be not really part of the solution. It might be something post-solution. We'll talk about fallback in just a second. But the idea of giving it an output format is really helpful. It's up there with giving it an example, because effectively an example is showing it an output format. Because then it says, I need you to stop meandering and thinking about all these places to go and focus on solving the problem. It's a really nice way to say, stop worrying about the squirrels and go and get this done. So this is the anatomy that he proposes. I purposely am attributing this to Nate for two reasons. One is it is really his IP, and his Substack is amazing. But secondly, there's a lot of models of frameworks for prompts, and most of them look kind of like this. But I wanted to be able to say that this is different from some of the other ones for a couple of reasons. One of them is the at the end here, so this output specification, that's new to me. The idea of an exemplar, an example, I've heard before. Usually that's the end. Usually that's as far as things I've seen before. But specifically saying, exactly what do you want? Do you want it to be JSON? Do you want it to be Markdown? Do you need it to be a sentence? Do you want it to be a table? Super helpful. And the last one is this idea of, if you don't have information, do this. Really helpful, because at this point it's solving the problem, and it may find, I don't know what to do there. This is going to help you to get around the hallucination problem, because you're telling it, if you don't know what to do or you don't have a good answer from the content I showed you or from your own memory, don't make up an answer. Do this instead. So I wanted to point those two out before we go through the rest. So I mentioned before, in the beginning, you want to give it context. So you're narrowing its search. You're allowing it to spend more time in the areas that you care about. That's really important. The next one is, who is this? So what's the advantage? You're a venture CFO. I don't know why you'd say that, but you're a pipe fitter, for example. I noticed Mike has just joined, or you're a CIO and so on. So it helps to narrow down what kind of answer you're going to get. The next one, again, you've heard this sort of thing, is, what do I want it to do? Try to be pretty narrow and say, list three risks. Is the example he gives, but one clear verb and then the object. So try to make the task statement as clear as possible. You can add bullets under it, but one that says, I need you to do this thing, and then you can say how you want to do it. And that's what constraints and style rules can be. So, I only want this to be 200 words. Really important, I find, because my gosh, it'll go off. And all of a sudden you're like, look, you've just created a new problem that I have to read 10 pages. I mean, I've gotten some outputs that are literally 30 pages, and it's like, who's got time for that? So telling it what constraints, do you want things to be bulleted? Do you want to avoid words, or do you want it to sometimes I find it's much better to tell it to give you layman's terms. Even if you know the words that it might use, it still takes up mental energy to translate that stuff and think about it. So sometimes it's better to just say, give me layman's terms, give me diagrams, give me bullets, whatever it is. The reality is AI is wonderful in how it can manage and handle lots of content and help you to think new things. But it absolutely runs the risk of being a burden where like, oh my God, I got to read all this. So giving it the most useful length and format is a kind of a hidden cheat code, I find, because otherwise, again, you're like, now I got to send the output of an LLM into another LLM so I can read something in the time that I've got, or the attention span, because at the end of the day, after reading 30 pages of pretty dense stuff, your brain isn't ready to do very much. You got to go get a cup of coffee. The other one that is really important that we often don't do is give it some examples. And this can be easier than you think. This can be a screenshot. This could be a copy paste. You don't have to write something if you can avoid it. And then again, after that is what do I want the output to be, and what do I want and what happens if you don't know the answer? I really like this. And in the actual article, he goes and says, why each of these are important. And I'm going to get to that in just a sec, but I want to underscore this idea that each step refines the one that was before it. So we start with the whole internet, then you tell it context, then you tell it your role, then you tell it what you want to get done. So now you've really started to narrow it down. Then you're starting to say how I want you to execute, and you're showing it an example, you're telling it what the output is, and then you're telling it what to do. So all of this is a series of refinements that help you get the answer you want the way you want. And the cool thing here is you can do things like if you write a good prompt, copy the prompt and put it into Word, or I actually use a text editor, which everybody has. Your system has a text editor, whether it's Mac or it's Windows. The value there is it doesn't have weird formatting and so on. But keeping prompts is a really good idea, because if you think about what I'm telling you today, I'm saying this is worth going through the process of thinking at each of these steps. Once you've done that once, you might want to reuse it. And I strongly suggest that. So going through each of these in kind of detail. So here is kind of the what it is and how it helps. This is kind of the proof of each of these. So the context is there's actually been studies, and he mentions the studies. I don't want to get bogged down with that here, but moving the same text from once to start to the beginning of a prompt changed the classification, changed the quality by double-digit margins. This was a study that was done. Another one, when you include the role or persona, this is a study that's in archive that showed that it changed the factual accuracy by telling it who it is and reduced bias across different models. So again, this is proving that this worked because people have tried it sometimes an awful lot. Giving it a really good statement, please answer, or I order you to, shifted its score on individual questions by 60%, which is kind of amazing. Again, dig into these if you want. I'm gonna link it when I post this. Constraint and style rules. Again, deleting a single formatting line. So give it the correct answer. Dropped it by over almost 10%, which is kind of amazing. And what's interesting is they tried this 19,000 times, which is amazing. The cool thing about this being technology, you can actually run it a lot and see what happens. This idea of few shot, when they say shot, this is a word that gets used in AI a lot. Shot means you gave it an example. So single shot means I showed it one example. Three shot means I gave it three examples. So again, really had an impact on performance. Same thing here, output specifications. So showed that it really had a big impact. Again, I don't want to dig into this. We're running a little thin on time. So I love the fact that each of these shows you that people have not only tried this, they've rigorously tested it to make sure that it has an impact, and it turns out to. So the next thing I want to do, I'm running through this kind of quickly, but bear with me. Why does all of this work? Like, what matters and why did it fail sometime? So it's important to understand the underlying thing that an LLM does when you give it a prompt. The first thing, some of you may have heard this term tokenization. So it turns out that you don't just give words to an LLM, it converts them into tokens. And the reason it does that tokens are all about the same length. So it works with tokens to understand what you're doing. The reality is it just means it's chopping it up into lengths that it can do something with. Then it embeds them into a thing called a vector, and I'll show you what that means in a second. Then it kind of keeps track of what was in what position. So what was the beginning of a sentence, what was the middle. Then it looks at and does what they call self-attention. Actually, that's the most important part here. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more in just a second. And then it says, okay, what do I do with that? So understanding each of these helps you understand how to write a prompt. So the first thing that happens is it splits the raw characters into what subword, or sometimes it's a full word. I purposely asked for a crazy example and it gave me one. So just so you know, I had ChatGPT do this for me. You can tell because it screwed this up, screwed up a word, which it didn't supposed to do anymore, but sometimes it still does. It has two A's in there or two I's. So it breaks this up into different parts. And that's why older models sometimes couldn't count the R's in a strawberry, for example, because it's separate tokens. So Mark is just joining us. Mark, I apologize. This is going to be recorded and posted on YouTube tonight. So you'll have everything that I've gone through. Anyway, so the point here is understanding that longer words get chopped up into smaller chunks, and that means that things go wrong sometimes. And it explains again why some weird stuff sometimes happens. Like, as I say, you can't count the R's in strawberry because it was, straw, BER, and then RY, and it got it wrong. Um, Once it's been split into tokens, the next thing that happens is it puts it into an embedding, a multi-dimensional embedding, which is a little beyond what we're talking about today. But the net is what it does is say along these dimensions, where does this word sit? So dimension one might be how round something is. I'm making that up. And another one might be how much of an animal it is. Again, these are just two dimensions among many. But the point is, that's how it knows how similar things are. This is how all natural language processing works, by the way, not just LLMs. This stuff was all innovated in the 2010s, actually, probably even earlier than that. But anyway, the point is, it goes and it indexes so it understands where things are. This matters because as you put things in there, if you're adding extra words, it's going to do that with those new words. And now it has to manage even more vector embeddings and try to understand what your sentence means in total. The next thing it does is positional signaling. So this is having it understand what is where, just understanding its positions. What's interesting is the further you are from the end of the prompt, the signal decays with distance, and newer tokens get a little bit more weight than older tokens. Again, this matters as you write longer and longer prompts. For what it's worth, this is also why there's something called a context length. There's a number of tokens that the LLM can handle, and it's a total budget. Now, recent models have such big context lengths that it really doesn't matter. But in the past, you could only have 1,028 tokens was like, GPT 3.5, I think. And that was not a lot. And then you had 14K tokens and so on and so forth. But anyway, the point is this is why sometimes a token budget will matter. The other thing that's important is when you're paying for an API, you're paying for the number of tokens, the number of these. So if you're giving it a really long sentence, or importantly, like a long article, you're paying something. It's barely anything, but it does add up when you give it too much. So this is just giving you an understanding of what tokens are. The really magical thing here is this thing called of self-attention. And actually, I had ChatGPT go back in and rewrite this so that it would be as understandable as possible. So basically, the model is reading a sentence one word at a time, always moving from the left to the right. So it's moving from the beginning to the end, not necessarily going back. Each new word, it forms a question about that word. It tries to understand what does it mean in the context of what it knows so far. It then checks that running memory with what it already holds, these kind of notes and the details for every earlier word. So it's summing up as it goes through. Of course, this is all happening in the blink of an eye. It's building a better and better understanding of what's going on one step at a time. So it's comparing its current question to each note. It figures out which earlier words matter most. It assigns them weights. So it's trying to understand the sentence. And maybe the word the means less than what's right next to it, which could be the button or something. And it sums up to 100%, so it can't go on forever. Mixes these stored details to get the information it needs. Because the model's only allowed to peek backward, it never sees words that haven't been read yet, which kind of makes sense. The next layer does this over and over again. And the point of all of this is giving you an understanding of how it not only reads your prompt, but for a couple of things. One is more recent things at the end of the prompt tend to be a little bit more determinative of what it's going to ultimately do for you. But also, as it's going through, it's starting to really understand and actually recalculate what it's read before so that it can understand what's important about your prompt and what's important about your question. So hopefully that makes sense. It's actually kind of a deep understanding, a deep point. I encourage you to go, if you didn't understand what I said, go ask ChatGPT to explain causal self-attention to you and keep going until you understand it. Then it goes and says, great, based on now these percentages that it's mapped onto the question, it uses that to answer the question and to fill in the blank. One of the things you may have heard is LLMs are essentially filling in the blank, and your prompt is creating that blank. So now that it's created all these percentages, it says, okay, now I know how to go answer your question based on the percentages of what I've seen before. So some takeaway rules of thumb. We're getting close to the end here. I want to be respectful of people's time. There's five of them that he nets out with. One of them is pin your policy and role before the chat starts. So use that markdown to make sure it knows who you are. They become the first keys that kind of helps everything else later. You can also put them in your system prompt. Or your personalization prompt. Refresh essentials. If this becomes a really long message where you're going back and forth, pop in a reminder of things like, remember that you're a pipe fitter. Remember that we're doing this, whatever it might be. Keep that going so that it stays on track. End with the schema you want parsed. So this again is back to that idea of however you want this thing to look at the end, make sure that you're putting that in the end. Keep your demos tight on most relevant last. So if you're doing demonstrations, if you're doing examples, don't have long ones and put it towards the end. Otherwise it's going to forget it as you do more things. Nothing beats a new session. I love this one. I do this a lot. Is look, man, sometimes you just have to hit hard reset, create a new session, and start again. Because sometimes you can't help the fact that some part of your prompts kind of got it off. What do you call it, got it off track, and it's really hard to get it back on track. So sometimes you just need to restart. So the last thing I'll talk about is I strongly encourage you, all of the prompts, all the UIs do this. Go in and spend real time thinking about this. So you can go into, this is in ChatGPT, customize ChatGPT, and you're going to see two areas. And again, Nate has an entire article about this. But you can go in and say, who do you want? That's easy. What do you do? It's nice to give it a good description here, but the big one is traits, and then what else should it know about you? And I actually went in, I'm going to show you what I asked, and I actually spent time on this myself, but I had ChatGPT write it, and I then had it do that in Canvas so I could go and change it and tweak it myself. So these are the traits ChatGPT should have. There's a lot in here. And what it'll do is give you much more accurate, much more useful answers than you're otherwise going to get. This looks like an awful lot. So again, I'd say based on what you know about me, write a prompt for what I should put in traits GPT should have, and tell it to do that in Canvas. So just real quick, if you went into ChatGPT and said, create a system prompt for me, and then say, do it in Canvas, right? Then it's going to create something in a format that you can go and not only prompt, but you can go back and forth with it and ask questions from ChatGPT. I'm going to let it do some thinking while I continue to go through this. The second one is same thing. As I said, what I'd like ChatGPT to know. I did the same thing, and it gives me kind of a background on me that helps it to narrow down. So every time I ask it a question, I don't have to put this in here. It's going to include that itself, which I absolutely love. Just one more. It's going to take longer than I wanted it to. Anyway, so for those of you who understand how Canvas works, it allows you to highlight content, and then it allows you to. Here we go. So I can go in here, and so Canvas is a little bit separate. Grok has something kind of similar. There's some others that do this as well, but basically what it's doing is creating it for me. So something that I can go in. Now, the point that I love about this is I can highlight something and ask ChatGPT and say, please explain further. And it's going to go and I didn't even think very hard about that. But the point is it's going to go answer that, and I can continue to edit this with the content that it gives me. So folks, that's it for today. I went pretty quickly through this. I will link to Nate's two posts, which I think are fantastic. Frankly, his Substack is really great. I'm a subscriber. So hopefully you enjoyed this and got something out of it. The point in all of this is there's an awful lot more you can do with prompts to make simple ChatGPT and Grok and Gemini and all of them more valuable and more useful for you. I encourage you to dive in and check it out. Thank you.